Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. How does a civilization that likely never existed become more real than empires that once ruled the world? Why has a story told by one philosopher in ancient Athens outlived the memory of actual cities that traded, warred, and thrived for millennia? Atlantis has no ruins for archaeologists to excavate, no coins for collectors to catalogue, no inscriptions for linguists to decipher. Yet for over 2,000 years, it has commanded more expeditions, inspired more theories, and captured more imaginations than civilizations whose stones we can still touch. Perhaps the answer lies not in what Atlantis was, but in what it continues to be. A mirror held up to every age that searches for it, reflecting back our deepest fears about how paradises are lost and our most desperate hopes about what might still be found. Tonight, we will navigate the strange waters between myth and history, following Atlantis from its birth in Plato's dialogues to its endless reincarnations in human consciousness. We will explore the civilization as Plato described it in meticulous detail, its concentric rings of land and water, its temples plated with silver and gold, its sophisticated laws, and fatal hubris. We will trace how each era has reimagined this lost world, from Renaissance cartographers placing it on their maps, to modern satellites scanning the ocean floor. Our journey will reveal not just a story about a sunken island, but a tale about the stories we tell ourselves when faced with the rise and fall of civilizations. If you could spare a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, it would help me tremendously. These small gestures make a real difference in keeping this content coming. I'm always amazed by how far-reaching these videos are, so please let me know in the comments where and when you're tuning in. Release the weight of today and allow your mind to wander gently back through time to Athens, in the year 360 BC, where the afternoon sun slants through the columns of a gymnasium, the air carries the scent of olive oil and dust from the wrestling grounds, and an elderly philosopher is about to speak words that will echo through eternity. In this moment, in this place of learning and leisure, Plato will give birth to a legend that refuses to die, a paradise that exists nowhere and everywhere, a warning wrapped in wonder. The story of Atlantis is about to begin, not with the island's creation, but with its creation as an idea, a dream, a question that each generation must answer anew. Part 1. The birth of the legend. The philosopher's dream. The year is 360 BC, and Plato is 70 years old. In the shaded colonnades of the Academy, the school he founded just outside Athens' walls 2 decades earlier, the aging philosopher has been wrestling with questions that have occupied him since he watched his beloved teacher Socrates drink hemlock. What makes a state just? How do civilizations rise to greatness? And perhaps most haunting of all, why do they fall? The olive groves surrounding the Academy whisper in the afternoon breeze, their silver-green leaves catching the light like coins scattered across the hillside. Inside, where the walls are covered with geometric proofs, and the air carries the faint sweetness of papyrus and ink, Plato begins to craft what will become 2 of his most enigmatic dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. Unlike his earlier works, which dissected abstract concepts of justice, truth and beauty, these dialogues will contain something unprecedented in his philosophical corpus. They will tell a story, not a myth borrowed from Homer or Hesiod, not a parable meant merely to illustrate a point, but a detailed historical account of a civilization that once challenged Athens itself. The story emerges through the voice of Critias, Plato's great-grandfather, who claims to have heard it as a boy from his grandfather, who received it from no less a figure than Solon, the legendary lawgiver of Athens. This chain of transmission, stretching back through 4 generations of one of Athens' most distinguished families, lends the tale an air of inherited authority. But Plato, master of irony that he is, never quite commits to whether we should believe it. The Greek word he uses to describe the account hovers ambiguously between true story and likely tale. What drives a philosopher in the twilight of his years to invent, if indeed he did invent, such an elaborate fiction? Athens in 360 BC is not the imperial power it was in the previous century. The Peloponnesian War has been over for 40 years, but its scars remain visible in broken walls and broken spirits. The democracy that executed Socrates has been restored, overthrown, and restored again. Perhaps in Atlantis, Plato sees a dark mirror of his own city's trajectory, the corruption of noble beginnings, the intoxication of power, the inevitable reckoning. Or perhaps he needs Atlantis to exist precisely because it doesn't, a perfect control in his philosophical experiment, a civilization whose every detail he can craft to serve his argument about the fate of states that abandon wisdom for wealth. The candle burns low as Plato writes, his aged hands steady despite the years. Outside, nightbirds call across the academy grounds. He sets down his stylus, having just described how Atlantis vanished in a single day and night of misfortune. The story is complete. What Plato cannot know is that his philosophical thought experiment will outlive the academy, outlive Athens, outlive even the memory of most real cities that existed in his time. He has created something that will prove impossible to destroy, a civilization that exists purely in the realm of human imagination and therefore can never truly die. The sacred archives of Sais. You are Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, and the year is 590 BC. Your reforms have saved Athens from civil war, breaking the chains of debt, slavery, and establishing laws that will endure for centuries. But now, your work complete, you have imposed upon yourself a 10-year exile to prevent any faction from pressuring you to alter your carefully balanced constitution. Your travels have brought you to Egypt, to the ancient city of Sais, in the Nile Delta, where temples older than memory rise from the fertile black soil. The temple of Neith towers before you, its massive pylons covered with hieroglyphs that dance in the flickering light of oil lamps. The air is thick with frankincense and myrrh, sacred resins that make each breath feel like a prayer. You have come here, as countless Greek intellectuals have come before, seeking the wisdom of a civilization that counts its years in millennia, while Greece counts in centuries. The priests of Neith, their heads shaved and gleaming, their white linen robes spotless despite the dust that swirls through the courtyard, regard you with the patient amusement they reserve for all Greek visitors. To them, you are children, precocious perhaps, but children nonetheless. In the inner sanctuary, where few foreigners are permitted, an elderly priest named Sonchis beckons you closer. The walls here are covered floor to ceiling with hieratic script, the sacred writing that only the initiated can read. You Greeks, he says in accented but fluent Greek, his voice carrying the dusty authority of the archives themselves. You are always young. There is no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science hoary with age. The priest's fingers, gnarled as olive roots, trace the ancient symbols as he speaks. He tells you of catastrophes that periodically cleanse the earth, floods and fires that wipe away civilizations, leaving only the barest memory of what came before. Greece, he explains, has been destroyed and reborn many times, each iteration forgetting the last. But here in Egypt, where the Nile's regular floods protect them from the greater deluges that destroy other lands, the records survive. Here, in these sacred archives, are preserved histories that everywhere else have dissolved into myth. 9,000 years ago, Sonchis begins, and you struggle to comprehend such a span of time. In Greece, you consider events 500 years past to be lost in the mists of legend. But 9,000 years? The priest sees your skepticism and smiles, the expression of a teacher accustomed to students who cannot quite grasp the lesson. He continues regardless, describing a time when Athens, your own city, was the greatest power in the world, though no memory of this greatness survives among your people. And Athens' greatest rival, he says, was an island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, in the ocean you call Atlantic. Its name was Atlantis, and its power was so vast that it controlled Libya up to the borders of Egypt and Europe as far as Tuscany. The lamplight wavers, casting shifting shadows across the hieroglyphs. Sonchis speaks on, his voice hypnotic in its rhythm, describing the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis, the heroic resistance of your ancestors, and finally, the cataclysm that swallowed both the island empire and the ancient Athenian army in a single day and night. As he speaks, you try to memorize every detail, knowing that you will carry this story back to Athens, where it will be retold, reinterpreted, and eventually, centuries hence, immortalized by your descendant, Critias' great-grandson, a philosopher named Plato. 9,000 years before. 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, would place the destruction of Atlantis around 9600 BC, a date that should have been meaningless to Plato's 4th century audience, but resonates strangely with modern archaeology. This was the end of the Younger Dryas, the last gasp of the Ice Age, when global sea levels rose by hundreds of feet in a geological heartbeat, drowning coastlines that had been dry land for millennia. But Plato knew nothing of ice ages or paleoclimatology. His 9,000 years served a different purpose entirely. For the Greeks of Plato's time, the deepest reach of historical memory extended back perhaps 800 years to the Trojan War, itself already half dissolved into myth. The dynasties of Egypt and the king lists of Mesopotamia might stretch back 3,000 years, impressive to Greek minds but still comprehensible. But 9,000 years? This was not history. This was deep time, an abyss that swallowed human comprehension. By placing Atlantis at such a remote distance, Plato freed it from the constraints of verification. No one could fact-check events from 9 millennia ago. No inconsistencies with known history could disprove his account. Yet the specific number was not arbitrary. In Plato's cosmology, influenced by Pythagorean mathematics, 9,000 years represented a complete cycle, a perfect period, after which cosmic patterns repeat. The ancient Egyptians, whom Plato deeply admired, organized their calendar around similar vast cycles. The Turin Papyrus, which Plato could not have known, but which reflects traditions he might have encountered, lists Egyptian kings ruling for tens of thousands of years before the first human dynasties. These impossible dates were not errors, but theological statements about the intersection of divine and human time. Consider what the world looked like in 9600 BC, though neither Plato nor anyone in his era could have known these details. The Sahara was green, crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. Britain was connected to Europe by a land bridge that hunter-gatherers crossed following herds of reindeer. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake. Smaller than today, its shores home to communities that would one day be drowned when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus. Humanity had not yet invented agriculture, though in the hills of what would become Turkey, wild wheat was beginning to be gathered in ways that would soon lead to its domestication. Into this unimaginable past, Plato projected a civilization of impossible sophistication. His Atlantis possessed writing, metallurgy, urban planning, naval technology, and complex government structures that wouldn't appear in the actual archaeological record for thousands of years after his supposed date. This anachronism was not carelessness, but intention. Plato needed Atlantis to be both impossibly ancient and technologically advanced to serve his philosophical purpose. It had to be a civilization comparable to 4th century Athens in its sophistication, but removed from contemporary politics by an unbridgeable gulf of time. The 9,000-year interval also served a moral function. It was long enough for all physical traces to have vanished, explaining why no evidence of Atlantis remained, but it was also recent enough, in geological terms, for the moral lesson to feel relevant. The forces that destroyed Atlantis, divine punishment for hubris and corruption, could strike again. Athens itself, Plato implied, might be cycling through the same pattern of rise, corruption, and potential catastrophe. The vast span of time transformed Atlantis from a historical cautionary tale into something more profound, a meditation on the eternal patterns that govern the rise and fall of all civilizations, whether real or imagined. Part 2. The Island Paradise. Poseidon's chosen land. In the beginning, before the first temple stone was laid, before the harbours were carved from living rock, before the concentric rings that would define Atlantis for all time, there was only a low hill rising from a fertile plain, 50 stades from the southern coast of the island. Here lived a mortal woman named Plato, orphaned and alone, beautiful in the uncomplicated way of those who live close to the earth. And here came Poseidon, earth-shaker, lord of horses and seas, drawn by some quality in this solitary hill that resonated with his divine nature. The god's courtship, if we can call it that when power meets mortality, transformed both the woman and the landscape. Poseidon enclosed the hill, where Plato lived with alternating rings of sea and land, 3 of water and 2 of earth, carved with divine precision, as if with a cosmic compass. These rings were equidistant from each other, making the island impossible to approach by ship. For this was an age, Plato tells us, before the art of navigation was known to mortals. The mathematical perfection of this arrangement was no accident. Plato, student of geometers and mystics, understood that perfect circles were the language of the divine, the shape that has no beginning and no end, the form that planets trace through the heavens. From the union of Poseidon and Plato came 5 pairs of twin sons, divine blood mingling with mortal flesh to create something new under the Sunday. The eldest was Atlas, from whom both the island and the ocean that surrounded it would take their names. These were not the crude demigods of older myths, driven by passion and appetite. They were philosopher kings, before philosophy existed, rulers who carried divine wisdom in their veins. Through them, Poseidon established a covenant with the island, a sacred order that would govern Atlantis for thousands of years. The god's gifts to his chosen land were both practical and miraculous. He caused 2 springs to flow from beneath the earth at the centre of the island, one warm and one cold, waters that possessed healing properties and never ran dry even in the driest seasons. The warm spring steamed gently in the morning air, its minerals leaving deposits of yellow and white that gradually built fantastical formations like frozen waterfalls. The cold spring was so pure that it seemed to hold light within itself, sparkling, even in shadow. Around these springs, the Atlanteans would later build their greatest temples and palaces, but in those first days, they were simply proof of divine favour, tangible evidence that this land was different, chosen, blessed. The soil itself responded to Poseidon's presence, becoming so fertile that it yielded harvests without cultivation, fruits that grew wild but perfect, grains that sprouted wherever seeds happened to fall. The very rocks contained veins of precious metals that seemed to pulse with their own light. Most precious of all was orichalcum, a metal found nowhere else on Earth, which gleamed with a red-gold fire and was valued by the Atlanteans second only to gold itself. Modern readers puzzle over orichalcum, proposing brass or copper alloys, but Plato's point was not metallurgical but mythological. Atlantis possessed something unique, something that could exist nowhere else, because the place itself was unique, marked by divine intervention in the physical world. The architecture of perfection. You stand at the outermost harbour of Atlantis, at the height of its glory, salt spray cooling your face as you gaze inward toward the city's heart. The harbour where you stand is 3 stades wide, carved from black volcanic rock that still bears the marks of Poseidon's original creation. Hundreds of triremes rest at anchor here, their bronze rams catching the morning light, their purple sails furled like sleeping wings. The sound is overwhelming. Shipwrights' hammers, merchants haggling in dozen languages, the creak of cranes lifting cargo, and beneath it all, the eternal rhythm of waves against stone. A covered channel, wide enough for the largest warship, cuts through the outer ring of land toward the second harbour. As your boat glides through this tunnel, darkness envelops you, broken only by oil lamps set into niches every 20 feet. Their flickering light reflecting off the water like fallen stars. The ceiling above, carved from solid rock and polished to mirror smoothness, carries the sounds of the city above. Footsteps, cartwheels, the distant music of a religious procession. Then suddenly you emerge into the middle harbour, smaller than the outer but more magnificent, where the royal fleet rests between towers, plated with tin that blazes white in the Sunday. Another channel, another passage through stone, and you reach the innermost harbour, a perfect circle, where the water is so still it seems solid, like green glass. Here dock only the sacred vessels, those that carry the kings to their councils, their hulls painted with scenes from the founding of Atlantis, their prows carved into hippocampi, the horse serpents sacred to Poseidon. The bridges spanning these harbours are themselves marvels, each different, each a statement of engineering prowess. One of white marble that seems to float above the water, another of that mysterious orichalcum that glows like sunset, a third of polished black stone, inlaid with gold depicting the constellation of Poseidon's crown. But it is the central island that stops your breath. The entire Acropolis is surrounded by a wall plated in brass that burns orange in the light. Within that, a wall covered in tin that gleams silver white, and finally, surrounding the temple itself, a wall coated in orichalcum that pulses with its own inner fire. The temple of Poseidon rises from this metallic rainbow like something not built but grown, its proportions so perfect that your eye struggles to grasp its actual size. 600 feet long, 300 wide, 300 feet tall, every surface covered in silver, except the pinnacles, which are gold, so pure it seems liquid. Inside the temple, if you were permitted to enter, you would see Poseidon himself, rendered in gold, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, so tall that his head brushes the ivory ceiling. Around him spiral 100 nereids riding dolphins, also gold, their faces each unique, each captured in an expression of joy so vivid you expect to hear their laughter. The altar is a single block of orichalcum, 20 feet long, its surface worn smooth by centuries of sacrifice. The ceiling is painted to represent the ocean's surface seen from below, schools of fish rendered in such detail you can identify each species, rays of sunlight penetrating blue-green depths that darken toward the edges, where sea monsters lurk in shadow. The palace complex spreads beyond the temple, like a city within a city, its own hot and cold baths, some open to the sky, others covered for winter use, separate facilities for royalty, for guards, for women, even special pools for horses, all fed by those original springs that Poseidon called forth. The excess water flows through carved channels into sacred groves, where trees unknown anywhere else in the world bear fruit that tastes like honey mixed with wine. Every 50 stades throughout the plain beyond, watchtowers rise 500 feet into the air, allowing signals to flash from the mountains to the sea in minutes. A network of communication that binds the vast island into a single organism. Gardens of abundance. The plain of Atlantis stretches 3,000 stades in length and 2,000 in width, a rectangle of such perfect fertility that even Plato, usually reserved in his descriptions, allows wonder to creep into his prose. This is not the harsh limestone and scrub of Greece, where farmers must coax reluctant crops from rocky soil. This is abundance beyond the dreams of any Mediterranean people, a land where the earth seems eager to yield its treasures, where 2 harvests ripen each year without exhausting the soil, where irrigation channels flow with such precision that no field ever knows drought. The channels themselves are a marvel of planning that would make Roman engineers weep with envy. The Great Perimeter Canal, 100 feet deep and a stade in width, runs around the entire plain, collecting water from the mountain streams that would otherwise flood the lowlands. From this master canal, straight channels run to the sea at intervals of 100 stades, while cross-channels connect these, creating a grid that serves simultaneously for irrigation, drainage, and transportation. In the rainy season, excess water flows controlled to the sea. In the dry months, the stored water flows back through the same channels, regulated by a system of locks and gates, operated by hereditary guilds who pass their knowledge from father to son through generations. Between these channels, the land produces everything necessary for life, and most things that make life pleasant. Grains grow so tall that a mounted rider disappears among them. Fruits hang so heavy that branches must be propped to prevent breaking. But it is the diversity that astounds. Roots and herbs unknown to the outside world, flowers that bloom year-round in sequence, so there is never a day without fresh garlands. Trees that produce not just food but resins for perfume, bark for medicine, wood so hard it rings like metal when struck. The Atlanteans have vegetables that grow beneath the ground, larger than amphora, vines that produce grapes in 7 different colours, each with its own intoxicating wine. The animals that inhabit this paradise are equally remarkable. Herds of horses, descended from Poseidon's sacred stock, run semi-wild through designated meadows, their coats gleaming like polished wood, their manes flowing like water. Cattle grow to enormous size on the rich pasturage, their meat marbled with fat in patterns that look deliberate, almost decorative. But most astonishing are the elephants. Yes, elephants, here on an island in the Atlantic, browsing in marshlands near the coast. Their presence so matter-of-fact in Plato's account that he doesn't even attempt to explain it. These are not the small forest elephants of North Africa, but great tusked beasts, whose ivory is carved into furniture, whose strength helps build the massive temples, whose trumpeting at dawn serves as the city's awakening. in the sacred groves, maintained by priests who speak to plants in languages older than human speech, grow trees that exist nowhere else on earth. One bears fruit that satisfies both hunger and thirst, its flesh somewhere between bread and meat in consistency. Another produces leaves that, when dried and burned, create smoke that induces prophetic dreams. A third weeps a resin that, when hardened, becomes transparent as water but stronger than bronze, used for windows in the greatest palaces. These gardens are not wild, but neither are they entirely tamed, existing in a state of cultivated perfection that mirrors the Atlantean civilization itself, nature elevated by human intervention without losing its essential vitality. The climate collaborates in this abundance. Harsh winds are blocked by the northern mountains, while gentle sea breezes moderate the summer heat. Rain falls precisely when needed, so regularly that farmers plan their calendars by it. Snow never falls on the plain, though the mountain peaks wear white crowns year-round, feeding the rivers that never run dry. Even the seasons seem more clearly defined here than elsewhere, each with its distinctive character, but none so extreme as to threaten comfort. It is as if the island exists in a perpetual state of late spring, becoming early summer, warm enough for swimming, cool enough for labour, perfect for the outdoor life that the Atlanteans favour. The 10 Kingdoms. The governance of Atlantis represents Plato's attempt to imagine a perfect federalism, a balance between unity and autonomy that Athens, with its fractious democracy, and Sparta, with its rigid oligarchy, could never achieve. When Poseidon divided the island among his 10 sons, he established not just territories but a sacred constitution, laws that were literally written in stone, or rather engraved on a pillar of orichalcum that stood in the temple of Poseidon, gleaming with its peculiar red-gold light, visible from every corner of the sacred precinct. Atlas, the eldest, received the central kingdom surrounding the capital city and held the high kingship over his brothers. His realm was the jewel of the empire, but his authority over the other 9 kingdoms was carefully circumscribed. Each brother ruled as absolute sovereign within his own territory, raising his own armies, collecting his own taxes, administering his own laws. Yet in matters that concerned the whole island, they were bound by Poseidon's covenant to act in concert. This was not a loose confederation, but a mystical union, renewed every 5th and 6th year, alternately in a ceremony that blended religious ritual with political covenant. The ceremony itself speaks to something deep in human psychology, the need to sanctify power with sacrifice. The 10 kings would gather in the temple of Poseidon, where bulls sacred to the god roamed free in the sacred enclosure. Armed only with wooden clubs and nooses, no iron weapons permitted in this holy hunt, the kings would pursue and capture one of the bulls. This was not sport, but sacrament. Kings who commanded thousands would humble themselves to chase an animal with their own hands, risking injury, accepting exhaustion, reminding themselves that power comes from strength and courage, not just from birth. When the bull was caught, it would be led to the pillar of orichalcum and sacrificed over the inscriptions, its blood flowing across Poseidon's laws in a literal blood oath. The kings would drink from a golden cup mixed with wine and the bull's blood, then cast the remainder into the fire, while swearing to judge according to the laws on the pillar and to punish any brother who violated them. They would neither attack one another nor fail to come to each other's defense if attacked. The royal line of Atlas would lead in war, but no death sentence could be passed without the consent of at least 6 of the 10. After the oath-taking, when night had fallen and the fire had died to embers, the kings would don azure robes, the colour of the deep ocean where Poseidon dwells, and sit among the cooling ashes to judge any accusations between them. Their verdicts would be inscribed on golden tablets and dedicated in the temple, creating a accumulating record of justice that served as precedent for future generations. This midnight court, lit only by stars and the fading glow of sacrificial fires, represented law at its most primitive and most sophisticated simultaneously. Kings judging kings, power constraining power, the living honouring the dead through adherence to ancient law. The 10 kingdoms were not equal in wealth or size, but each possessed its own character and contributed something essential to the whole. The mountainous northern kingdom provided minerals and timber. The eastern coastal kingdom excelled in shipbuilding. The western kingdom, facing the open ocean, produced the finest navigators. The southern kingdoms, with their extended plains, grew the grain that fed the capital. This diversity was not accident but design, forcing cooperation, making autarky impossible, ensuring that the bonds between the kingdoms remained practical as well as sacred. For generations uncounted, this system worked. The regular gatherings prevented grievances from festering. The shared rituals reinforced common identity. The blood oath made betrayal not just political crime but religious sacrilege. But built into this perfect system were the seeds of its own destruction. For what happens when the divine blood thins through generations of intermarriage with mortals? What happens when kings forget that their midnight judgments once carried the weight of divine law? What happens when the orichalcum pillar becomes just metal, the bull's blood just blood, the oath just words spoken in an ancient formula whose meaning has been forgotten? Plato, master of irony, shows us perfection precisely so we can watch it crack, crumble, and finally, cataclysmically, collapse. Part 3. The Fatal Transformation. The weight of gold. For thousands of years, the divine blood of Poseidon flowed through the veins of Atlantean kings like liquid light, making them something more than human, wiser, more just, more capable of seeing beyond the immediate gratification that enslaves ordinary mortals. But blood, even divine blood, follows its own laws. With each generation, as the sons of gods married the daughters of men, that golden ichor thinned, diluted like wine, mixed with more and more water, until only the faintest taste of the original vintage remained. The change was invisible at first, manifested only in small failures of judgment, minor relaxations of ancient standards. Where once the kings had walked to the temple for the sacred ceremonies, they began to be carried in litters. Where once they had fasted before the bull sacrifice, they began to feast, reasoning that strength required sustenance. The azure robes worn for judgment, originally simple wool dyed with sea urchin, became elaborate costumes encrusted with gems, so heavy that servants had to help the kings don and doff them. These were not corruptions but improvements, they told themselves, befitting the glory of an empire that now controlled territory from the Pillars of Heracles to the borders of Egypt. The wealth that had once been consequence became purpose. In the early days, gold and silver had decorated temples because the gods deserved beauty. Now temples were built specifically to house treasures, vast underground vaults where orichalcum ingots were stacked like common bricks, where pearl strands hung like cobwebs, where gems were sorted by colour into great bins as farmers might sort beans. The harbour masters kept ledgers that recorded not the number of ships, but the weight of precious metals they carried. Children learned arithmetic by calculating interest on loans, rather than by measuring land for equal distribution. You can see it in the architecture of the later period, if you know how to look. The ancient buildings had been built to proportion, their beauty arising from mathematical harmony. A temple was pleasing because its length related to its width, as its width related to its height, ratios that echoed the music of the spheres. But the newer constructions were built to impress through sheer scale and ostentation. Columns that needed to be only 20 feet tall, that were made 40 feet, not for structural reasons, but simply to dwarf visitors. Walls that should have been limestone were faced with marble, then plated with bronze, then gilded, layer upon layer of expensive concealment, until the actual structure disappeared beneath its decorations. The very language changed, developing elaborate honorifics and circumlocutions that replaced simple speech. Where once a king might have said, "Bring water," he now required, "Let the crystal essence of Poseidon's blessed springs be conveyed in vessels, worthy of its sacred nature, to quench the divine thirst of the descendant of the Earth-shaker." Meetings that once concluded in an afternoon now stretched for days, as each speaker tried to outdo the others in florid rhetoric. The ancient laws on the orichalcum pillar, written in sparse, clear language that a child could understand, required teams of priests to interpret, their meanings twisted through layers of commentary, until they could mean whatever the current kings needed them to mean. The relationship with the land transformed as well. The fertile plain that had given 2 harvests through the wisdom of seasonal cultivation was forced to yield 3, then 4, through increasingly desperate interventions. New canals were cut, without regard for the natural flow of water. Forests were cleared to create more farmland, not recognizing that the trees had held the soil that made farming possible. The sacred groves were harvested for their precious resins until the trees grew sick, then were replaced with faster-growing varieties that produced more resin but lacked the subtle properties of the originals. The elephants, once allowed to roam freely, were chained and made to perform in spectacles, their majesty reduced to entertainment. Most tellingly, the Atlanteans began to see their prosperity not as divine gift, but as divine right. The old prayers of gratitude became demands. Where once they had asked Poseidon to continue his blessings, they now reminded him of their sacrifices, as if keeping accounts with the god of the sea. They looked at the nations around them, those who struggled with poor soil and harsh weather, not with compassion but with contempt. Clearly these lesser peoples were not beloved of the gods. Clearly they existed to serve those who were. The logic was as perfect as it was poisonous. We are wealthy because we are virtuous. We are virtuous because we are wealthy. And anyone who is not wealthy is therefore not virtuous and deserves whatever fate the virtuous choose to impose. The march against Athens. The final madness began, as madness often does, with a perfectly reasonable proposition. The kings of Atlantis gathered for their regular council in the 5th year of what would be their last cycle, though none knew it then. The ceremony proceeded as it had for millennia. The bull was hunted, the blood was spilled, the oaths were sworn. But when they sat in judgment in their azure robes, the discussion turned not to disputes between kingdoms, but to opportunities beyond them. The High King, the latest to bear the name Atlas, was young, only 30 years old, with a kind of sharp intelligence that cuts rather than illuminates. He had studied the maps, he said, calculating the resources of every nation from the western shores of Africa to the islands of the Greeks. Atlantis controlled the ocean, but why should they stop at the water's edge? The inland peoples were weak, divided, spending their strength in petty wars against each other. Would it not be a kindness, really, to bring them the peace of unified rule? Would they not benefit from Atlantean engineering, Atlantean agriculture, Atlantean order? The other kings listened, and in their hearts, each performed his own calculations. The northern king thought of the gold mines in Iberia. The eastern king imagined controlling the grain supplies of Egypt. The southern king dreamed of African ivory and slaves. They cloaked their greed in philosophy, arguing that they had a duty to spread civilization, that the strong were obligated to guide the weak, that unity under Atlantean rule would end the constant warfare that plagued the Mediterranean. By dawn, when the judgment session ended, they had convinced themselves that conquest was not just profitable, but moral. The mobilization was unlike anything the world had seen. Every shipyard on the island worked through the night, the sound of hammers never ceasing, sparks from forges, visible from miles away, like new constellations. The sacred groves were stripped to build a fleet of 10,000 vessels. The elephants were armoured and trained for war, bronze plates protecting their skulls, sharpened swords attached to their tusks. Men between the ages of 16 and 60 were conscripted, organised into units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, a human machine as precisely engineered as the irrigation channels that had once brought life to the plain. The invasion began from the west, following the African coast. City after city fell, not always to battle, but often to the mere sight of the Atlantean fleet, darkening the horizon like a floating mountain range. The war elephants, creatures that Mediterranean peoples had never imagined, much less faced, broke defending lines, not through casualties, but through terror. The conquered territories were not destroyed but absorbed, their populations registered, their resources catalogued, their young men added to the ever-growing army. What had begun as an Atlantean invasion became a multinational force, though the gold of Atlantis and the swords of Atlantis ensured who truly commanded. Through Libya they marched, the elephants leaving prints in the sand that looked like craters, the supply trains stretching back to the coast, where ships continuously arrived with provisions. Egypt, ancient even then, closed its borders and paid tribute rather than fight, gold and grain flowing west to avoid the fate of their neighbours. Up through the Levant, the army moved, then west along the northern Mediterranean, gathering the tribes of Italy as either allies or slaves. By the time they reached the borders of what would later be called Tuscany, The Atlantean Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the edges of the Greek world. Only Athens stood against them, not the Athens of Pericles and the Parthenon, but an Athens that existed, if it existed at all, in the deep past that Plato's Egyptian priests claimed to remember. This Athens had no empire, no great fleet, no silver mines to pay mercenaries. What it had, according to Plato's carefully constructed narrative, was virtue. Citizens who fought for freedom rather than gold, leaders who served the state rather than themselves, the kind of pure patriotism that Plato desperately wished his own corrupt contemporary Athens could recover. The battle, when it came, was impossible. The Atlantean forces outnumbered the Athenians 50-1. The war elephants alone should have shattered the Greek phalanxes. The Atlantean navy controlled the sea, preventing any supply or reinforcement. Yet somehow, through courage that transcended calculation, through unity that made each citizen fight, as if the fate of the world depended on his personal effort, which in a sense it did, Athens held. The details of the battle are deliberately vague in Plato's account, because details would diminish the myth. What matters is not how Athens won, but that it won. Proof that virtue can triumph over power, that small nations defending justice can defeat great empires pursuing greed. The night of destruction. But the god's judgment, when it comes, makes no distinction between victorious Athens and defeated Atlantis. Both have played their roles in the cosmic drama, and both must exit the stage. The destruction begins not with thunder or earthquake, not with any of the dramatic warnings that storytellers usually provide, but with silence. The birds stop singing, the waves pause mid-break, the wind holds its breath. For a moment that stretches like eternity, the entire world seems to wait. You are a fisherman on the western coast of Atlantis, mending nets as your grandfather taught you, your fingers performing the familiar movements without conscious thought. The silence makes you look up, and you see something impossible. The ocean is pulling back, exposing the seafloor for a mile beyond the normal low tide mark. Fish flop helplessly in suddenly waterless pools. Octopi drag themselves desperately across exposed rocks seeking deeper water. The harbour bottom, which you have never seen, is littered with anchors and amphora from centuries of maritime accidents, now revealed like secrets that were meant to stay buried. Your grandfather once told you a story his own grandfather had told him, about a time when the sea fled and then returned with a vengeance. You drop your nets and run, not toward the exposed treasures that some of your neighbours are already hurrying to collect, but inland, up toward the hills, your lungs burning as you climb. Behind you, though you dare not look back, you hear it coming, a sound like mountains falling, like the earth itself clearing its throat. The tsunami, though that word will not exist for millennia, rises from the retreated ocean, not as a wave, but as a wall of water, 300 feet high, black with churned sediment, crowned with a foam that looks like snow. The water hits the outer harbours, with force that turns solid stone to powder. Ships are not sunk, but obliterated, transformed instantly from elaborate constructions to scattered splinters. The great bridges, those marvels of engineering that had stood for 1,000 years, snap like twigs. The walls plated with brass, tin, and orichalcum are stripped away. The metals that had gleamed in the sun now, just debris in a liquid avalanche that recognizes no distinction between precious and common. The Temple of Poseidon, that massive structure that seemed as permanent as the island itself, is lifted from its foundations and carried inland, whose self, rolling like a boulder, crushing everything in its path before finally disintegrating into blocks that will puzzle future archaeologists who will never find them. But water is only half of the island's doom. As the tsunami spends its force, the earth itself rebels. Cracks appear in the Great Plain, not the small fissures that sometimes accompany earthquakes, but chasms that open wide enough to swallow entire cities. The irrigation channels that had seemed to work with nature now become weapons against human habitation, channeling not water, but liquid mud that buries the fertile fields beneath hundreds of feet of sediment. The mountains to the north, which had protected the plain from harsh winds, collapse inward, their peaks disappearing into valleys that no longer exist. In Athens, the victorious army camps on the plain of Marathon, or what would one day be called Marathon, celebrating their impossible victory against the Atlantean forces. The earth beneath them liquefies. a phenomenon geologists will later call liquefaction, where solid ground becomes quicksand in an instant. The entire army, 10,000 men who had stood against an empire, sink into the earth as if the ground were water, their bronze weapons and armour dragging them down faster than those who had thrown away their equipment in the face of the impossible. Within minutes, nothing remains but a muddy plain that looks as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The end comes with darkness, not the gradual darkness of sunset, but an immediate absence of light, as if the sun itself has been extinguished. Volcanic ash, though Plato does not call it that, fills the air so thickly that breathing becomes drowning in dust. Those who survived the water and the earthquake now suffocate in air turned solid, their last sight, the red glow of lava, fountaining from what had been the sacred springs of Poseidon, the hot and cold waters that had blessed Atlantis, now become the instruments of its cremation. By morning, Atlantis is gone, not ruined, not diminished, but gone, as if it had never existed. Where the great island had stood, only muddy shoals remain, too shallow for ships to cross, clogged with a pumice that will make the Atlantic impassable for generations. The few survivors on distant shores, traders and ambassadors who escaped the island's fate by the accident of travel, try to tell their stories, but who would believe them? Within a generation, Atlantis becomes a cautionary tale. Within a century, a legend. Within a millennium, a dream that philosophers debate and sailors claim to glimpse on foggy mornings when the light plays tricks on water. The gods' message, if message it was, could not be clearer. Prosperity without virtue is not just unstable, but doomed. Power that forgets its purpose will be not just defeated, but erased. And perhaps most terrifying of all, the same divine forces that raise civilizations to glory can, in a single day and night of misfortune, return them to the elements from which they arose, leaving future generations to wonder whether they ever existed at all. Part 4. The Search Through Time. Renaissance Awakening. In Constantinople, in the year 1453 AD, as Ottoman cannons breach the mighty Theodosian walls, Byzantine scholars flee westward, clutching manuscripts more precious than gold. Among these rescued treasures are complete copies of Plato's dialogues, including the Timaeus and Critias, texts that had been all but forgotten in Western Europe during the long medieval centuries. These Greek writings, carried by desperate refugees, will ignite a revolution in European thought that transforms not just philosophy, but the very map of the world. The manuscripts arrive in Florence, just as the Medici banking fortune reaches its zenith, financing a flowering of art and learning unprecedented since classical times. Marsilio Ficino, court philosopher to Cosimo de' Medici, receives a complete Greek text of Plato in 1462. His hands tremble slightly as he unrolls the papyrus, the Greek letters swimming before eyes more accustomed to Latin scripture. When he reaches the passages about Atlantis, he stops, reads again, then calls for his best scribes. Within months, his Latin translation spreads through the academies and courts of Europe, like water through those perfectly engineered Atlantean channels Plato had described. The timing could not be more electric. Columbus has not yet sailed, but Portuguese navigators are already pushing down the African coast, each expedition returning with tales of lands unknown to Ptolemy or Strabo. If the ancient geographers could be wrong about Africa, might they also have missed an entire continent in the Atlantic? The word Atlantis begins to appear in navigation charts, not as myth but as possibility, a magnetic pull drawing European imagination westward. Map makers, those half artists, half scientists, who gave visual form to the expanding world, begin placing tentative islands in the Atlantic void, each one a potential remnant of Plato's lost continent. When Columbus returns in 1493, with news of lands across the Western Ocean, the connection seems inevitable. Here are islands inhabited by people who build pyramids, like the Egyptians whom Plato said remembered Atlantis. Here are civilizations with gold in abundance, like the Atlanteans with their orichalcum treasures. The Spanish conquistador Francisco López de Gomara writes with certainty in 1552 that the Americas are Atlantis, that Plato's Egyptian priests had preserved a garbled memory of a real continent, that European courage has now rediscovered. The indigenous peoples, in this interpretation, are not new encounters but old relatives, descendants of Atlantean colonists who survived the catastrophe. Sir Francis Bacon, writing his New Atlantis in 1626, takes a different approach. His island, called Ben Salem, lies in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic, but its essence is pure Platonic speculation, a civilization that achieves perfection through science rather than divine blood, wisdom rather than wealth. Bacon's Atlanteans have flying machines and submarines. They can cure diseases that plague Europe. They govern through merit rather than birth. This is Atlantis reimagined, not as historical fact, but as future possibility, a blueprint for what human society might achieve if it embraces empirical investigation and technological progress. The Renaissance transformation of Atlantis, from philosophical allegory to geographical reality, reflects the period's fundamental character, the simultaneous reverence for ancient authority and rebellion against its limits. Scholars who could read Plato in the original Greek were also the ones funding expeditions to prove him wrong, or rather, to prove him right in ways he never intended. The lost continent becomes a screen onto which Europe projects its anxieties about the New World. If the Americas are Atlantis, then European colonization is not conquest but reclamation. If indigenous peoples are degraded Atlanteans, then European rule is not oppression but restoration. The myth, intended by Plato as a warning against imperial hubris, becomes justification for the greatest imperial expansion in human history. The Victorian obsession. The year is 1882, and in a mahogany-panelled study in Philadelphia, Ignatius Donnelly puts the finishing touches on a manuscript that will become one of the best-selling books of the 19th century. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, is not presented as speculation, but as scientific demonstration, complete with maps, geological diagrams, and linguistic analysis that would seem convincing to anyone lacking expertise in those fields. Donnelly, a failed politician turned amateur scholar, has spent years in the Library of Congress, gathering every myth, legend, and flood story from every culture he can find, weaving them into a pattern that places Atlantis at the centre of human history. You open Donnelly's book in a Victorian drawing room, the gaslight casting dancing shadows on the wallpaper, the air thick with pipe smoke, and the peculiar mixture of confidence and anxiety that characterises the age. His arguments unfold with the relentless logic of a steam engine. Why do pyramids appear in both Egypt and Mexico? Because both learn the technique from Atlantis. Why do flood myths exist in cultures from Mesopotamia to Michigan? Because all preserve memories of Atlantis' destruction. Why do certain plants and animals exist on both sides of the Atlantic? Because Atlantis was the land bridge across which they travelled. Each piece of evidence seems irrefutable until you realise the circular logic. Atlantis must have existed because these similarities exist, and these similarities exist because Atlantis existed. The book sells 500,000 copies in English alone, with translations spreading across Europe faster than any academic text. But Donnelly's Atlantis is not Plato's cautionary tale. It has become something distinctly Victorian, a master race from which all civilization descends, a technological paradise destroyed by natural catastrophe rather than moral failing, a secular Eden that replaces biblical authority with scientific terminology. The Atlanteans of Donnelly's imagination are essentially perfected Victorians possessing all the industrial achievements of the 1880s, plus advances that the current age is just beginning to glimpse. Madame Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, takes Donnelly's material history and transforms it into a cult mythology. In her massive work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, Atlantis becomes the home of the fourth root race of humanity, possessing psychic powers that material science has forgotten. Her Atlanteans are 15 feet tall, communicate telepathically, and understand the secret energies that power the universe. They destroyed themselves, not through hubris, but through black magic, misusing cosmic forces that modern humans are only beginning to rediscover through seances and mesmerism. Blavatsky claims her information comes not from archaeological research, but from astral projection to the Akashic records, a cosmic library where all history is preserved. The late Victorian period transforms Atlantis into a mirror of its own obsessions: racial hierarchy, technological progress, spiritual crisis, and imperial destiny. Social Darwinists use Atlantis to explain why some races are naturally superior, claiming descent from Atlantean colonists, while relegating others to pre-Atlantean primitiveness. Inventors claim to be rediscovering Atlantean technology, filing patents for perpetual motion machines and death rays supposedly based on ancient principles. Spiritualists conduct seances to contact Atlantean spirits, who conveniently confirm whatever theory the medium happens to support. By the century's end, Atlantis has become so embedded in popular culture that serious scholars feel compelled to address it. The classicist Lewis Spence attempts to find middle ground, proposing that while Plato's specific Atlantis might be fiction, it preserves genuine memories of Paleolithic civilizations destroyed by the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. His books sell nearly as well as Donnelly's, feeding a public appetite that grows rather than diminishes with each new theory. The search for Atlantis has become an industry, supporting authors, lecturers, expedition leaders, and even early documentary filmmakers who promise to reveal, at last, the truth behind the legend. The archaeological fever. Heinrich Schliemann stands on the hill of Hissarlik in 1873, his workmen having just uncovered what he will call Priam's treasure, gold artifacts, from a city that scholars had insisted was pure myth. Troy was real. The man who found it by trusting Homer's poetry over academic skepticism becomes the hero of every amateur archaeologist who dreams of proving the experts wrong. If Troy could emerge from legend into history, why not Atlantis? The discovery of Troy triggers a gold rush of archaeological ambition. Every gentleman explorer, with means and imagination, begins looking for Atlantis, armed with Donnelly's theories and Schliemann's example. The search takes on the character of a sacred quest, part science, part adventure, part mystical journey. Expeditions set out for the Azores, where volcanic peaks might be the mountaintops of sunken Atlantis. Others dredge the seafloor off Spain, searching for the Pillars of Hercules that Plato said marked Atlantis's location. Each expedition that fails simply proves that the next one might succeed. In 1900, Arthur Evans begins excavating at Knossos in Crete, uncovering the palace complex of what he names the Minoan civilization. The discoveries are staggering. Multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing, beautiful frescoes showing bull-leaping ceremonies, evidence of a maritime empire that dominated the eastern Mediterranean before mysteriously vanishing. The parallels to Atlantis seem unmistakable. Here is an island civilization, advanced beyond its neighbours, with a ritual relationship to bulls, destroyed suddenly by what appears to be natural catastrophe. The nearby island of Santorini, excavations reveal, experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history around 1600 BC, sending tsunamis across the Mediterranean that could have destroyed the Minoan fleet and coastal settlements. Spyridon Marinatos, director of the Greek Archaeological Service, makes the connection explicit in the 1930s. Plato's Atlantis, he argues, is a distant memory of Minoan Crete, transformed through Egyptian telling and Greek philosophy into something grander and more remote. The 9,000 years becomes 900, a simple scribal error. The Atlantic location reflects Greek geographical confusion about anything beyond the Mediterranean. The bulls, the naval power, the sudden destruction, all fit perfectly. For the first time, Atlantis has a serious archaeological candidate, complete with pottery shards and carbon dating. But even as Marinatos builds his careful case, wilder theories proliferate. Edgar Cayce, the American psychic, claims that Atlantean records are buried beneath the right paw of the Sphinx, waiting to be discovered in the late 20th century. Nazi expeditions search for Atlantis from Tibet to the Arctic, seeking proof that the Aryan race descends from Atlantean supermen. Soviet scientists propose that Atlantis was the first communist state, destroyed by capitalist contradictions. Each ideology finds in Atlantis exactly what it needs to find. The development of new technologies in the mid-20th century revolutionizes the search. Sonar mapping reveals underwater structures off Bimini that look like roads or foundations, though geologists argue they are natural beach rock formations. Satellite imagery identifies circular formations in the Spanish marshlands of Doñana that match Plato's description of concentric rings. Deep-sea submersibles explore the mid-Atlantic ridge, where tectonic plates pull apart, looking for evidence of sunken lands that geologists insist cannot exist. What begins to emerge from serious archaeological investigation is not Atlantis, but something perhaps more interesting: the realization that sea levels have changed dramatically in human history, that advanced civilizations have risen and fallen, leaving barely a trace, that catastrophic events have indeed destroyed entire cultures in single devastating moments. The Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, killing 250,000 people in a few hours, suddenly makes Plato's description of Atlantis' destruction seem less hyperbolic. The discovery of Doggerland, the inhabited plain that connected Britain to Europe before being flooded by rising seas, shows that Atlantis-like stories might preserve genuine memories of lost lands. Yet the more science explains, the more the mystery deepens. Each genuine discovery of a lost civilization or sunken land increases rather than decreases the appetite for Atlantis. The legend adapts, absorbs new information, evolves to remain always just beyond the reach of proof or disproof. Atlantis has become archaeological dark matter, invisible but necessary, its gravitational pull shaping how we think about the past, even as it remains forever absent from the actual archaeological record. Part 5. Modern Echoes. Beneath the waves, Jacques Cousteau descends through the blue void off the coast of Santorini in 1975, bubbles from his regulator, ascending like silver jellyfish toward the surface that grows more distant with each meter. The water here is so clear that vertigo threatens the sensation of falling through air rather than swimming through sea. Below him, the seafloor slopes away into darkness that swallows even his powerful lights, the remnant of a volcanic caldera that once rose thousands of feet above sea level before the Earth swallowed itself in one of history's most violent convulsions. His team has been searching for weeks, following sonar anomalies that might be ancient walls or merely tricks of geology. The volcanic ash preserved Pompeii. Might it not also preserve an Atlantean settlement beneath these waves? Every squared stone could be a building block. Every regular formation might be the work of human hands rather than nature's coincidences. Cousteau himself remains skeptical, but understands the power of the quest. The search for Atlantis funds expeditions that might otherwise never happen, drives technological innovation that serves genuine archaeology, captures public imagination in ways that pure science never could. The invention of side-scan sonar in the 1960s transforms the ocean floor from opaque mystery to readable text, though the language remains ambiguous. Straight lines appear where nature supposedly abhors them. Right angles emerge from sediment that has accumulated for millennia. Circular formations suggest human planning rather than geological accident. Each anomaly generates expeditions, headlines, breathless documentaries that promise this time, surely this time, Atlantis has been found. The disappointments, when squared stones prove to be pillow lava formations and ancient roads turn out to be natural beach rock, never diminish the enthusiasm for the next discovery. You are a sonar operator on a research vessel in the Mediterranean, watching the seafloor scroll across your screen in shades of green and black. The computer builds a three-dimensional map in real time, each pass adding detail to underwater mountains and valleys that no human eye has seen. Suddenly, there it is, a perfect rectangle, 200 meters below the surface, too regular to be natural. Your heart rate spikes as you mark the coordinates, already imagining the documentary cruise, the book deals, the vindication of every dreamer who insisted Atlantis was real. But when the submersible descends to investigate, the rectangle dissolves into randomness, a conjunction of natural features that only looked meaningful from one specific angle with one specific technology. The ocean keeps its secrets through scale as much as depth. The Atlantic alone covers 20 million square miles, an area so vast that you could hide a dozen Atlantises and never find them without knowing exactly where to look. Modern satellites can map the ocean floor through variations in surface height, caused by underwater mountains and trenches, but the resolution remains coarse, able to detect features miles across, but missing anything the size of mere cities. Every improvement in technology reveals new mysteries that might be Atlantis, but might equally be the thousands of coastal settlements flooded when the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose 400 feet. In 2001, Paulina Zalitsky announces the discovery of what appears to be a megalithic city 600 meters beneath the sea off the western tip of Cuba. Sonar images show what look like pyramids, roads, and plazas arranged in geometric patterns. The depth itself tells a story. This land has been underwater for at least 50,000 years, far longer than any human civilization. Either the dating is wrong, the geology is misunderstood, or these formations are natural. Zalitsky promises definitive proof from robotic submarines, but the proof never comes. The Cuban government restricts access, funding dries up, and the discovery joins the long list of underwater anomalies that might be anything or nothing. The Mediterranean candidates. Malta rises from the Mediterranean like a limestone question mark, its surface scarred by cart ruts that lead directly into the sea, as if ancient traffic continued beneath the waves. The temples here, Hedgantia, Ajar-Kim, Menajdra, are older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids, built by a people who vanished without explanation around 2500 BC. In these massive stones, some weighing 50 tons, moved and placed with precision that challenges explanation, believers see the hand of Atlantean engineering. The Maltese archipelago was once much larger, connected to Sicily, when sea levels were lower, a fertile plain where now there is only water. Core samples from the seabed reveal pollen from plants that grow only on dry land, evidence of forests and fields that thrived where fish now swim. The medieval Maltese historian Giovanni Francesco Abella wrote of traditions passed down through generations, stories of a great flood that swallowed most of the islands, leaving only the highest peaks above water. These folk memories align suspiciously well with geological evidence of post-glacial flooding. But memory and geology are not archaeology, and no one has found an Atlantean artifact in Malta's meticulously excavated sites. In Spain, the marshlands of Doñana National Park hold their own mysteries. Here, where the Guadalquivir River meets the Atlantic, satellite images reveal circular and rectangular patterns beneath the wetlands, ghostly geometries that match Plato's description of Atlantis's concentric rings. During drought years, when the water table drops, these patterns become more distinct, as if the Earth itself is trying to reveal what it has hidden. German physicist Rainer Kuhne argues that this is Tartessos, the semi-mythical city that Greeks knew as fabulously wealthy, trading in silver and tin, before vanishing from history around 500 BC. You walk through Doñana at dawn. The marsh grass is heavy with dew that soaks through your boots within minutes. The rising sun turns the water channels to copper, the same colour, you cannot help but think, as Plato's mysterious orichalcum. Flamingos pick their way through the shallows on legs that seem too delicate to support their bodies, their pink coloration coming from the tiny crustaceans they filter from the mud, the same mud that might hide a civilization. Every step you take sinks slightly, the ground neither fully solid nor entirely liquid, a liminal space that seems appropriate for a place balanced between history and myth. Richard Freund, conducting geological surveys here, finds evidence of tsunamis that periodically devastated this coast, methane vents that could cause the ground to liquefy, all the natural disasters that Plato described. His team finds what might be a ceremonial altar, or might be a natural stone formation. They find evidence of ancient occupation. But whether it was Tartessos, Atlantis, or merely one of hundreds of trading posts that dotted the ancient Mediterranean coast remains frustratingly uncertain. The Spanish government, perhaps tired of treasure hunters disrupting a national park, restricts further excavation. Sardinia presents another compelling candidate. Here are the Nuraghi, thousands of stone towers built by a Bronze Age civilization that left no written records, but clear evidence of sophisticated organization. The Sardinian coast shows evidence of significant subsidence. Roman ports now lie beneath the waves, and who knows what older harbours lie deeper still. The island's position in the western Mediterranean fits, if we assume Plato's Pillars of Hercules meant not Gibraltar, but the straits between Sicily and Tunisia, a reasonable interpretation given Greek geographical knowledge of his era. The proliferation of Mediterranean candidates reflects a logical truth. This sea, the centre of the ancient world, holds more submerged history than anywhere else on Earth. Every coastal civilization built harbours that rising seas or tectonic subsidence has drowned. Alexandria's ancient lighthouse lies beneath the waves. Parts of Naples's Roman resort towns are accessible only to divers. Venice is sinking before our eyes. If Atlantis existed in the Mediterranean, it has abundant company in its watery grave. The Atlantic theories. The Azores rise from the mid-Atlantic ridge, like the vertebrae of some impossible creature, volcanic islands that exist only because the Earth is literally pulling itself apart here, new seafloor spreading from a wound that runs from Iceland to Antarctica. If you were to drain the Atlantic, the ridge would stand as Earth's longest mountain range, and the Azores would crown peaks, rising 15,000 feet from the abyssal plain. For those who take Plato's Atlantic location literally, these islands are the smoking gun, the mountain peaks of Atlantis that remained above water when the rest of the continent sank. The geology tells a different story, one of volcanic birth rather than catastrophic subsidence. These islands are young, in geological terms, built by successive eruptions over merely millions of years. There was no continent here to sink. There is only new land still being born, yet the believers point to curious evidence, ancient maps that show islands in the Atlantic that don't correspond to anything currently above water, beach sand found at depths where beaches shouldn't exist, tool marks on rocks dredged from impossible depths. Each piece of evidence has a geological explanation, but taken together, they create a pattern that teases the imagination. In 1968, the Bimini Road captures world attention. Pilots flying over the shallow waters off Bimini in the Bahamas photograph what appears to be a half-mile long, ancient road or wall lying in 15 feet of crystal clear water. J. Manson Valentine, who investigates the site, declares it artificial, possibly the top of a wall that once stood on dry land. The massive blocks, some 15 feet square and weighing several tons, are arranged too perfectly to be natural. This is exactly where Edgar Cayce predicted Atlantean ruins would be discovered in 1968 or 1969, a coincidence that sends occultists into ecstasies of vindication. Marine geologists study the formation and conclude it is beach rock, a natural phenomenon where beach sand cements together along fracture lines, creating regular blocks that can indeed look artificial. The road follows the curve of an ancient beach, exactly as natural beach rock should. Core samples reveal no difference between the constructed blocks and the underlying bedrock. Yet believers note that the Greeks built with local stone, that weathering could obscure tool marks, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Bimini Road becomes a Rorschach test. Scientists see nature, believers see culture, and both are absolutely certain. The Atlantic Oceanic Ridge itself presents the most fundamental problem for any Atlantic Atlantis. The seafloor here is spreading, not sinking. Continents don't disappear. They drift, collide, and crumple, but they don't vanish beneath the waves in a single day. The oceanic crust is thin and dense, the continental crust thick and buoyant. For Atlantis to sink, it would have to violate the laws of plate tectonics, laws as fundamental to geology as gravity is to physics. Yet the ancient myths speak consistently of sunken lands: Lemuria in the Pacific, Mu in the Indian Ocean, Lyonesse off Cornwall, Ypres off Brittany. Are these all fantasies, or do they preserve memories of coastal lands lost to rising seas, transformed through retelling into continents that never were? The search continues with technology Cousteau could barely imagine. Autonomous underwater vehicles map the seafloor in resolution measured in centimeters. Satellite altimetry detects variations in the ocean surface caused by underwater features too subtle for any other method to find. DNA analysis of human populations traces migrations that might preserve evidence of Atlantean diaspora. Each advance in technology is immediately applied to the search as if finding Atlantis has become not just an archaeological goal, but a test of human ingenuity itself. What drives this endless search? Perhaps it is the same impulse that made Plato invent Atlantis in the first place. The need to believe that somewhere, somewhen, human beings got it right, built the perfect society, achieved the ideal balance. And if they did it once, perhaps we can do it again, if only we can find and learn from their example. Or perhaps it is darker, the need to believe that even perfection is temporary, that every golden age ends in catastrophe, that our own civilization's fears of decline and fall are part of an eternal pattern that began with Atlantis and will continue until the last city disappears beneath. The last wave. Part 6. The Eternal Return. The Psychological Continent. Carl Jung sits in his study in Bollingen Tower in 1934, the stone walls he built with his own hands, containing him like a second skin. Outside, Lake Zurich laps against the shore with the rhythm of a sleeping heartbeat. He has been studying the dreams of his patients, hundreds of them, and the same images appear again and again. A city of concentric circles, a great flood, a paradise lost beneath the waves. These patients have never read Plato, know nothing of Atlantis, yet they dream its geography with startling precision. The collective unconscious, Jung writes, contains archetypal memories that belong not to individuals, but to the species. Atlantis, in this interpretation, is not a place but a pattern, a psychological template for how human beings understand, rise and fall, creation and destruction, paradise and exile. Every culture has its flood myth, not because they all remember the same historical flood, but because the flood represents something fundamental in human psychology, the fear that everything we build can be washed away, the knowledge that every structure contains the seeds of its own dissolution. The archetype of the sunken city speaks to something deeper than history. It is the return to the womb written large, the dissolution of consciousness back into the unconscious, the ego overwhelmed by the waters of the id. When we search for Atlantis, we search for our own lost wholeness, the integrated self that existed before consciousness split us into observer and observed. The concentric rings of Atlantis mirror the mandala, that universal symbol of psychological integration that appears in every culture, from Tibetan Buddhism to Navajo sand paintings. To find Atlantis would be to find ourselves, which is why the search must always fail and always continue. You close your eyes and descend into your own consciousness, past the daily concerns that ripple the surface, past the personal memories that form your identity, down to the deep waters where your dreams originate. Here, in the darkness that is not dark, in the silence that hums with potential, you find images you cannot explain, a city you have never seen but recognize, a catastrophe you never experienced but remember. These are not your memories, but humanity's memories, preserved not in brain tissue but in the patterns of mind itself, the same patterns that made Plato write of Atlantis, that make each generation search for it anew. The psychological necessity of Atlantis explains its protean nature, why it can be whatever each age needs it to be. For the Renaissance, it was proof that the ancients knew of the Americas. For the Victorians, it validated racial hierarchies and technological progress. For the New Age movement, it represents lost spiritual wisdom. For environmentalists, it warns of ecological catastrophe. Atlantis is a mirror that shows not the past, but the present, not what was lost, but what we fear to lose. Modern neuroscience offers its own interpretation. The human brain evolved to detect patterns, to find meaning even where none exists, because seeing a predator that isn't there is less fatal than missing one that island. This hyperactive pattern detection, called pareidolia, makes us see faces in clouds, hear voices in static, and find lost civilizations in natural rock formations. Atlantis may be the ultimate expression of pareidolia, a pattern so compelling that we project it onto random seafloor formations, ancient ruins, and ambiguous myths, creating meaning from noise because meaning, even false meaning, is psychologically necessary. Atlantis in popular dreams. In 1870, Jules Verne sends Captain Nemo and Professor Aronnax walking through the ruins of Atlantis in diving suits, their footsteps raising clouds of sediment that have lain undisturbed for millennia. Verne's Atlantis, in 20,000 leagues under the sea, is melancholic rather than magnificent, its broken columns and crumbled temples illuminated by undersea volcanic light, a civilization reduced to picturesque rubble. This is Atlantis as romantic ruin, beautiful in its decay, safely dead, and therefore available for nostalgic contemplation without the complications of actual encounter. By 1916, Pierre Benoit's L'Atlantide relocates Atlantis to the Sahara, ruled by the immortal Queen Antinea, who collects lovers like butterflies, killing them when she tires of them, and adding their mummified bodies to her collection. This Atlantis is not dead but deadly, a feminine trap for masculine explorers, the exotic other that must be conquered or escaped, but can never be truly known. The novel sells millions of copies and spawns multiple films, each adding layers of Orientalist fantasy to Plato's original conception. Disney's 2001 animated Atlantis, The Lost Empire, presents a living Atlantis powered by a mystical crystal that is both energy source and consciousness, protected by a dying civilization that has forgotten how to use its own technology. The protagonists are early 20th century explorers, giving the film a steampunk aesthetic that places it outside real history in a parallel timeline where Atlantis can exist without contradicting known archaeology. The Atlanteans are portrayed as noble primitives, corrupted by contact with the surface world, an inversion of the usual narrative, where Atlantis represents advanced civilization destroyed by its own sophistication. You scroll through Netflix in 2024, finding dozens of documentaries about Atlantis, each promising revolutionary discoveries, definitive proof, mysteries finally solved. The production values increase with each year, CGI reconstructions becoming so realistic that they seem more real than reality, more convincing than any actual archaeological site. These programs follow a formula as rigid as a sonnet: tantalizing introduction, historical background, new theory presented with breathless excitement, journey to remote location, sophisticated technology deployed, ambiguous results interpreted as confirmation, promise of future revelations that never quite arrive. Video games make Atlantis explorable in ways Plato never imagined. In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you can walk through an intact Atlantis that exists in a parallel dimension, its architecture a mixture of Greek, classical, and science fiction crystalline. God of War presents Atlantis as a weapon of Poseidon sunk to prevent its misuse. Tomb Raider makes it one of many lost civilizations for Lara Croft to plunder. Each iteration adds to the collective imagination of Atlantis, layers of fiction building on fiction until the original becomes almost irrelevant. The New Age movement transforms Atlantis into a spiritual paradise, where crystal technology channeled cosmic energy, where telepathy replaced speech, where healing was accomplished through sound and color. Books claiming to channel Atlantean wisdom sell millions of copies. Workshops promise to activate your Atlantean DNA. Meditation apps guide you through past life regressions to your Atlantean incarnations. This Atlantis is not lost, but accessible through consciousness expansion, not destroyed but ascended to a higher dimension, where it waits for humanity to evolve enough to rejoin it. Social media multiplies Atlantis theories exponentially. Every unusual Google Earth image sparks viral speculation. Every archaeological discovery gets reframed as potential proof. The algorithm feeds the hunger, serving up content that confirms whatever version of Atlantis you already believe in, creating echo chambers where speculation solidifies into certainty. The democratization of the search means anyone with an internet connection can become an Atlantis expert, can find their own Atlantis, can add their own chapter to a story that has been growing for 2.5 millennia. The warning across millennia. The year is 2025, and you stand on the shore of Miami Beach, watching the king tide flood Collins Avenue, salt water flowing into hotel lobbies, with the casual inevitability of something that happens now several times a year. The water is warm around your ankles, warmer than it should be, carrying fragments of suburban lawns and tourist dreams out to sea. This is not Atlantis sinking in a day and night of misfortune, but something perhaps worse. A slow-motion catastrophe that everyone sees coming but no one quite believes. Climate scientists, those modern prophets whose computer models, are our equivalent of ancient oracles, speak of tipping points and feedback loops, of ice sheets that could collapse not in millennia, but in decades, of sea level rise, measured not in millimeters, but in meters. The maps they produce show familiar coastlines erased. Great cities become archipelagos. Entire nations vanished beneath the waves. These are not myths or metaphors, but projections based on physical laws as immutable as those that govern the tides. Yet we receive these warnings with the same mixture of fascination and denial that Plato's Atlanteans must have felt in their final years, believing that what has always been must always be. The parallels to Plato's moral fable are almost too obvious to state. Like Atlantis, our civilization has achieved wonders that previous ages would have considered divine. We have built towers that scrape the sky, tunnels that run beneath oceans, machines that think and speak. We have conquered diseases, extended lifespans, connected the entire planet in an electronic web of instant communication. And like Atlantis, we have mistaken our power over nature for power over the consequences of our actions. We have forgotten, if we ever knew, that the same forces that raised us can cast us down. Bangladesh disappears incrementally, not in dramatic tsunami footage, but in the slow exodus of millions whose fields have turned to salt marsh, whose fresh water has gone brackish, whose homes flood with every monsoon and never quite dry before the next one comes. The Maldives, those perfect atolls that honeymooners' paradise, conduct underwater cabinet meetings to dramatize their plight, their highest point 8 feet above sea level, their existence measured now in decades rather than centuries. Tuvalu negotiates the digital preservation of its culture, uploading its language, songs, and stories to servers in safer countries, becoming the first nation to exist solely in the cloud. Atlantis in reverse. Venice floods more frequently each year. The Aqua Alta that once came rarely, now arriving with every storm, sometimes without storms at all. The city responds with engineering that would have amazed the ancient Atlanteans. Massive gates that can seal the lagoon from the sea, pumps that can move millions of gallons per hour, foundations reinforced with space-age materials. But every engineer knows this is borrowed time, that the sea is patient and inexorable, that Venice's fate was sealed the moment humans began burning coal in quantities sufficient to change the atmosphere itself. What Plato could not have known but somehow intuited is that civilizations do not usually fall to external conquest, but to internal contradiction. Atlantis was not defeated by Athens, but by its own success, its own wealth, its own loss of the virtue that created that wealth in the first place. We too face not alien invasion, but our own accumulated choices, the carbon debt of centuries of industrialization, the ecological overshoot of treating a finite planet as infinite resource. The barbarians at the gates are not foreign armies, but feedback loops we ourselves have set in motion. The undiscovered country. Perhaps the search for Atlantis continues not despite its impossibility, but because of it. In a world where satellite imagery has mapped every square metre of land, where deep-sea submersibles have visited the deepest trenches, where even the Amazon has been penetrated by Google Street View, Atlantis represents the last frontier, the final blank space on the map, where dragons might still live. To find Atlantis would be to lose Atlantis, to transform it from infinite possibility to finite disappointment, from dream to mere archaeology. Every generation must rediscover that Atlantis cannot be found, because Atlantis is not a place but a process, not a destination but a journey. The search itself transforms those who undertake it. Donnelly became a prophet of lost civilization. Cousteau became an ocean advocate. Countless amateurs became educated in geology, archaeology, and ancient languages. The quest for Atlantis has funded more legitimate archaeology than any other myth, has pushed the development of technologies from sonar to satellites, has inspired more people to study the past than any number of academic conferences. The Atlantis that matters is not the one that might lie beneath the waves, but the one that lives in human consciousness, constantly evolving, adapting to new knowledge while maintaining its essential mystery. This Atlantis is indestructible because it exists in the only realm that matters for myths, the human imagination. Every attempt to debunk it only adds to its legend. Every failed expedition becomes part of its story. Every scientific explanation of why it cannot exist becomes evidence of conspiracy to hide the truth. You sit in a library at 3 in the morning, surrounded by books about Atlantis, their pages filled with maps of places that don't exist, photographs of natural formations that might be artificial, arguments that circle back on themselves like Atlantis's concentric rings. The fluorescent lights hum with a frequency that seems almost musical, and for a moment, you understand something that cannot quite be put into words. Atlantis is the shadow cast by every real city, the perfection that makes our imperfections visible, the paradise that defines our exile. In the end, we search for Atlantis, not to find it, but to search for it, because the search itself is what makes us human. We are the species that looks for patterns in chaos, meaning in accident, purpose in existence. We tell stories about lost paradises, not because we believe they existed, but because the stories themselves create meaning, provide structure, offer hope that what has been lost might be found again, that what has fallen might rise, that somewhere beneath the waves of time and catastrophe and forgetting something precious waits to be discovered. The undiscovered country is not Atlantis but ourselves, and the search for one is always the search for the other. Every expedition that sets out to find Atlantis discovers instead the depths of human hope and folly, the persistence of wonder in an age that thinks itself beyond wonder, the enduring power of stories that are not true but are real in the only way that ultimately matters. They change those who hear them, who tell them, who search for their source in the depths of ocean and consciousness alike. Atlantis probably does not exist. Atlantis might never be found. Atlantis is more real than cities whose ruins we can touch, whose coins we can catalogue, whose inscriptions we can read. This is the paradox that Plato, philosopher of paradoxes, built into his tale from the beginning. He created a city that could only exist by not existing, a warning that could only be heard by those who understand it. It was never meant to be taken literally, a mirror that shows not the past, but the eternal present of human ambition and human frailty. And perhaps, in the end, that is discovery enough. Closing sequence. And so we return to the question that opened our journey. How does a civilization that never existed become more real than empires that once ruled the world? Perhaps we now understand that Atlantis endures precisely because it never was. Unlike Troy, whose discovery reduced it from infinite myth to finite archaeology, or Rome, whose ruins can be measured and catalogued until mystery becomes masonry, Atlantis remains forever potential, forever perfect, forever just beyond the reach of proof or disproof. It is the empty canvas onto which every age paints its own anxieties and aspirations, the absent centre around which our ideas about civilization, progress, and catastrophe perpetually orbit. Plato created not a lost city, but an immortal question, one that each generation must answer anew. What does it mean for a society to flourish, and what does it mean for it to fail? The legacy of Atlantis saturates our language so thoroughly that we rarely notice its presence. When we speak of utopia, we echo Thomas More's attempt to create his own Atlantis, a perfect nowhere that critiques the imperfect somewhere of reality. The word Atlas, mapping our world, derives from the king who ruled Plato's impossible island. Every time we describe something as lost to the ages or sunk without a trace, we invoke the imagery of that single day and night of misfortune. Even our word Atlantic carries within it the memory of a place that never existed, as if the entire ocean were named after a dream. The lesson Atlantis offers to our current moment could not be more urgent, as our coastal cities plan their managed retreats from rising seas, as we debate whether our technology will save or doom us, as we watch wealth concentrate into ever fewer hands, while democracy strains under the weight of its own contradictions. We are living through the same moral examination that Plato prescribed for his philosophical patience. Atlantis warns us that power without wisdom is not merely dangerous but doomed, that the forces which raise civilizations can just as easily drown them, that the line between triumph and catastrophe is thinner than the surface tension of water. Yet it also suggests something hopeful, that human beings have always feared the end, have always imagined it in detail, and have always survived to tell the tale. Thank you for allowing me to accompany you through these historical moments, these philosophical depths, these archaeological mysteries that may never resolve, but never cease to fascinate. It has been my privilege to walk with you through the rings of Atlantis, to dive beneath its theoretical waves, to surface again in our own time, with perhaps a clearer understanding of why we seek what cannot be found. Until tomorrow's tale, may you find tranquil rest.